Hi everyone, I'm Ellie from Home Cook Love. Very excited today to have Kristin and Caldera with us today. So Kristin was a chef for several years and she's just recently started a home baking business called Caldera Caking.
Yep, Caldera Caking.
Caldera Caking, yes. And she's founded that business to fuel her passion to making delicious and beautiful cakes. We had the privilege of tasting one of Kristin's cakes at my daughter's birthday yesterday, and it was fabulous. I'm very happy to have Kristin here today because she's going to teach us how to create the perfect icing. I'm sure some of you can relate that icing could be a little bit finicky to deal with. I personally haven't mastered it as yet. Whenever I'm doing icing, it feels like I'm playing with my kids' Play-Doh.
Okay.
So I'm very happy that Kristin here was a professional and she's going to show us today how to create the perfect icing. So have you any tips for us that we can take home with us after this? Something that we can remember while we're making icing at home?
Yeah, I think I'll probably go through it as I'm making the icing. I'll talk about some of the different types of icing and the benefits of each one.
Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
Great, awesome. So we'll get started with the demonstration and Kristin will show us how to create the perfect icing like right now.
Okay, so I guess first we'll start by talking about the different types of icing. So if you're on social media, you probably have heard of many different types of icings, and it seems as if every country has their own type. You might hear of American buttercream, which is just probably the buttercream that most of us think of from our childhood, and it's made from butter, beaten butter with icing sugar incorporated. So it can be a fairly sweet one, given that it's just primarily made up of so much sugar. A few of the other ones that get used quite often are Swiss meringue buttercream, Italian meringue buttercream. Those are both pretty common. And then some of the less common ones would be French buttercream, German buttercream. And I even came across one the other day called Russian buttercream, which is, I made it, and it's a bit unusual, but it starts with butter, which you beat in the mixer until it's nice and pale, and then you just slowly drizzle condensed milk in, and that makes a beautiful fluffy buttercream. So yeah, the differences would be, for example, the French buttercream is made with egg yolks instead of egg whites like the other meringue buttercreams. So I prefer to use the Swiss meringue buttercream. The reason that I choose this one is because it's very silky and smooth and less sweet than the American buttercream. Two which are very similar is the Italian meringue and Swiss meringue. Italian meringue is made by pouring hot sugar syrup into the egg whites, and that heats the egg whites and cooks them, pasteurizes them as it's mixing. So I choose the Swiss meringue buttercream because that one, you actually cook or pasteurize the egg whites over a double boiler, and that really just ensures that the egg whites are heated to the correct temperature, because if you're just pouring this hot syrup in, such as an Italian meringue, you don't really have that guarantee that the egg whites are going to come up to the safe temperature of 70 degrees, which kills the salmonella and makes those egg whites pasteurized and safe for use to eat them raw, essentially. So Swiss meringue, you have a pot of water and a bowl on top, and the water is simmering, and you're mixing your egg whites with your sugar until it reaches 70 degrees. And that can be a bit tedious, so I've gone and done that step already. So I have my pre-pasteurized egg whites here. When you're making a meringue, some important things, or probably they say the most important thing, is to make sure that your equipment is not at all greasy. Even a small smear of grease on your hands will create a meringue that doesn't rise. It will just be soupy. And that also goes for egg yolk, which might break into the egg whites as you're separating them, because egg yolks are so greasy and fatty that will contribute to the egg whites not turning into proper meringue. So yeah, you just got to make sure everything's nice and clean. I usually wash my equipment and then give it another rinse or wash with soap just to make sure that everything is clean and grease free. So you can do this type of icing if you have a stand mixer, such as a KitchenAid or Kenwood or any of those types of things. I wouldn't really recommend it if you've only got one of those hand beaters with the two little ones that spin and that you hold, because it does take quite a while. You could probably do it, but you might be there for about 15 minutes trying to achieve that nice fluffy stiff meringue. So I will do this first step. So I've got my machine set up and I'm just going to add my sugary egg white solution into my mixer and turn it on. It's going to be quite noisy and it will take about 10 minutes or maybe 5 minutes to whip up into a nice thick glossy meringue. We'll just check it again. Yep, and you can see this time as we lift up the peaks, it's very stiff and will hold its shape quite well. So at this stage, this is a nice glossy, thick meringue. And from here, we're going to add butter. The recipes will generally tell you to add it in cubes, but to be honest, I just kind of dollop it in, so we'll do that. At this stage, it will start to look funny as the fats from the butter start to incorporate with the egg whites, and quite often it will kind of split and start to look curdled and soupy, but don't give up, it will come back together as you continue mixing. So let's go ahead and do that. Yes, and I'll just quickly say as well about the temperature of the butter. So it needs to be room temperature, which depending where you live, in Brisbane here it's quite hot, and if you leave it out too long it will become very oily and very soft. So this one is room temperature, which has been in the fridge just to keep it from totally splitting and going oily, but you can see it's like you can spread it on toast, that kind of consistency. So that's pretty much what you want for this recipe. It's not quite there yet, but I'll just give it a bit of a mix. So you might be able to see how it has just turned quite thick and looks more like a whipped cream kind of consistency. So this is now your buttercream, and from this point you can add the vanilla. So I have some vanilla here which I've made actually just by boiling vanilla beans with sugar and water, the last of it. And then I'll just turn it back on to finish mixing that through. Okay, so when you're making the buttercream, there are some things that can go wrong, which is when you're mixing it, it might just continue to be really soupy and curdled and not come back together. Most of the issues that happen with Swiss meringue buttercream are temperature based. So if you've used butter, if you cook your egg whites and then put them in here. Mine were cold because they were in the fridge, but if you've cooked them straight away and put them in here while they were still warm, and then you've added butter, the butter can melt essentially. So there are lots of troubleshooting pages online. So essentially, if it's too warm, you would need to put it in the fridge for 5 or 10 minutes and then re-whip it, and it will come back. If it's too cold, you can just take out a little bit and gently microwave it till it turns a little bit warmer and liquidy, and then pour it back in, and then that will bring the whole temperature down. So it's kind of about finding the correct temperature, not too hot and not too cold. But there are lots of pages dedicated to troubleshooting meringue buttercreams if you did happen to have an issue. And if you don't have one of these mixes, and if you just wanted to do the American buttercream, that's okay too. So that would be beating with your little hand beaters, beating the butter until it starts to turn pale, and then gradually adding in your icing sugar. And as a finished product, there are, again, some differences in texture between the two styles. So a meringue buttercream, whether it's Swiss or Italian, they don't crust. We have what we call crusting buttercreams, which is probably within 5 minutes or so of doing a piping American buttercream, it will start to form a crust on the outside as the moisture evaporates and sets with a crust, which is actually pretty handy for when you're transporting and just like moving your cakes around, because if you happen to touch the side of the icing, it won't come off. You might dent it a little bit, but it won't have a big smear missing. So that's probably the best thing about American buttercream, is that it does crust, whereas these ones stay with that nice fluffy outside indefinitely, essentially, which can lead to smearing and bumping and those kinds of things once they're piped. We can move on to colouring, and Swiss meringue buttercreams do handle best when you use a particular type of colouring, which is what they call an oil-based colour. So this is my box of colours, and there's one particular brand that does this oil-based food colouring, and it's called Colour Mill, and that's this brand here. So Colour Mill, and it's an oil-based, as opposed to, you might have heard of Wilton food colouring and Americolor food colourings. These are both gel food colours, which are based more on water, I believe. So whichever one you have, they're all very, very concentrated into a thick paste or thick fluid. So when you're adding it to the buttercream, it doesn't dilute it and kind of split. If you are making American buttercream, one of these kinds of ones are also okay. It tends to take in this color better than what this will. But we can do a bit of a sample and see the difference between what it might look like if we add this or these. So we'll go ahead and do that. So you can just scoop out some of the buttercream. I'll just do a little bit for this test. So when you first whip your buttercream, because it's a meringue, it's a very air-based icing, and when you look at it, you will see lots and lots of little holes. So when you're piping and decorating, those holes don't look great when it's coming out of the piping bag. So usually once it's finished mixing with the whisk on, you can then just manipulate it in the bowl, and it will make it much, much smoother. But this will be done when we add the colour anyway. We'll be mixing it, which will knock that extra air out at that time. Oil-based colour, and in this bowl we will do the liquid-based colour. So you can see already how this one is more like liquid on, like water on a duck's back. It's kind of just running off and not really going into it quite as much. But if we mix it, it is going in. It's actually colouring quite well. So that's good to know. So with these kind of liquid colours, which you can buy at the supermarket, the thing with them is that the tones might not be as nice as, I mean, you know, you can see with these sets, they have very many different shades and tones, which might be more suitable for the kind of colour you're looking for. So this is a raspberry colour mill, and you can see it's kind of got that softer, deeper, where this one kind of looks a bit more fluoro. But you can always have a go at mixing colours as well. So you might put a little bit more red in there. And I'll try putting just a tiny, tiny touch of green to see if it kind of brings back that brightness a little bit. Usually I like to use brown to do that, to kind of dull the colour almost when they're a bit too bright and shiny. And yeah, so you can't really see the green, but it's kind of dulled that colour a little bit. So that's an option as well. You can just kind of have a play around with your colour combinations, depending on what it is you're trying to do. So you can probably see that this is now looking a bit smoother as well. It's quite smooth and glossy without many air bubbles, as opposed to, let's say, when it first came out of the bowl, and you can see it's quite bubbly and not particularly smooth. So yeah, that's for colouring. So we can just go ahead and colour some of our buttercream for icing. I don't often use these myself because I've got all of these kits, but as you guys domestically might not be investing in each of these bottles, they're about $8 just for one colour. You know, you're more, I guess, unless you're very into baking, then you're more likely to probably just get some of these supermarket ones. So it's also good. Oops, it's a bit slippery with all the oil. Good to see how they come out as well, if you guys are doing it at home. Yeah, so it's really quite a nice shade there. And I think I might just pop this one into here as well. Okay, so there's some colours for us to use. So this is a brownie, which I have prepared earlier. You could do whatever you liked with it. If you wanted, you could leave it in a whole slab like this and just decorate the entire top. Today, I think we're going to cut it into some shapes. You could also just trim the edges off and cut it into squares. So just really depends what you want to do. I have got some lovely platters here, which we can do the presentation on. Okay, so this is some little brownie circles. So I've made these brownies with my recipe, and I use Western Star butter, and I use the Good Harvest Company for the flours. These guys support the local farmers. They give 10 cents per pack to the farmers. So that's nice, just to support where I can with the products that I buy for my business. In terms of piping bags and tips, again, I've bought this domestic one, which you can find at the supermarket. It has a few plastic piping bags and some tips inside. So you can make different shapes using these different tips here. So it always comes with this piece, which actually goes inside the bag. And I'll just cut a bit of a hole in the tip. And what you do is you take the bag and you fold it over the top. And you've got two options, well, a couple of options I can suggest. One is that you're using your hand kind of in the shape of a C, and it gets tucked under here. And that's what you use to hold the piping bag open while you're filling it. Now this goes on the inside all the way down to the bottom. And then whichever tip you choose to use goes on top and just kind of screws into place. So to fill your bag, you can do it like a C shape like this. Or alternatively, you can find a cup or a large jar and put this in, and it will kind of do the holding bit for you and make a bit of a well in the middle, and then you can fill your icing inside like so. Scrape it. So make sure you fold the top over with like a fairly decent chunk, because that's going to be your clean section, so that you don't have icing oozing out to the top. So then you can unfold it, and essentially just using gravity, shaking it down and straighten your piping bag. Now you're going to gather the piping bag together, and using this part in here you can hold it like so, and the pressure is going to come from these fingers here squeezing. And you twist the piping bag to keep this tight so that it has pressure to squeeze out the other end. Otherwise, if this is all saggy, when you squeeze, it's just going to come out the other end and not really be effective. So between your thumb and your finger, and then twisting it to keep it nice and tight, and then you'll be squeezing. So you can do a test of your piping in the bowl or on a spatula or something of the sort, just to make sure that it's working well. And then from there, you can start your designs. So with these tips, you are somewhat limited with the different shapes and styles that you can do, but you can get fairly creative. But I'll just also show you, for example, this is my commercial set that I use, and it's always building. You can see there's still empty spaces for me to add more and more. But these are the couplers, which have essentially the same function as the one that went on the inside of this, but they go inside, and then you can change whichever tip you like, and you just screw the new one on the outside. So you get very fine writing tips or circles or blobs, and then you've got tips for making petals, different open stars and closed stars. There are lots of different types, and then quite a lot larger for those big, large, soft swirls as well. So if baking is something that you really love and you wanted to invest in, you don't need all of these, but in some of them, then that would help your piping abilities as well. But just to get started with this, there are different types that you can do with the star nozzle. So you could start in the middle and start to work your way around the outside. Yeah, and so that is creating a kind of rosette there. Another popular one that you see on top of cupcakes, for example, is the type where you make it a bit like an ice cream swirl. So that one would be going outside to inside, and you slowly start to build it up into a bit of a peak, like so. You also can do something where it's, I guess, something maybe like a shell, you might call it a shell, where you're starting on the outside and bringing it back to the middle. You can just layer that on top of the previous ones, and I might leave that for a bit of decoration with the other tips. You can also do something just like a bit of zigzaggy back and forth action there. So that would come out like that. So if you have very hot hands, the more you hold your piping bag, this area of the icing is going to get quite melted, depending on the weather surrounding you as well. But in Brisbane, that's fairly likely. So at some point, as you pipe, the icing will start to look quite oily and not holding its shape very well, in which case you want to stop using that icing because it's essentially melted. And if you've done some piping and put this down and gone and done something else or used some other colors, when you come back to this in about 5 or 10 minutes, this is going to start to have air bubbles in it again. So you can choose to use it or not to use it and just squeeze it out, give it another mix, and then get it back into the piping bag nice and fresh. So I'll do another piping bag now. So this is just a simple round tip, and I might do some green icing with this one. And then this one, there's not a lot you can do with the round tip, but you can do pretty much some nice little blobs, let's call them blobs, where you can build them on top of each other, or you can do them quite large, some small, just kind of for a bit of variation there, or you could do them all small. You can also do, try different things such as a zigzag. It's going to look fairly plain, given that it's just smooth all the way around. But yeah, just you can get kind of creative and see. And you can always just do little tests either on a board or a plate or your spatula and see how something's going to look before you try it. Sometimes with the thinner ones, I do kind of more like a squiggly one, but sometimes it can look a bit like earthworms. So, it's not always effective depending on the color that you've chosen. So this tip, you might be able to see, is kind of quite flat, a bit like a long and flat shape, as opposed to if you see this tip here, which has a narrow end and a nice thick end, which gives you a bit more shape and definition. But we'll do what we can with this one, and then I'll also just give you an example of what you might be able to do with this tip, for example. Style. Like so, to make quite a neat ribbon, almost like ribbons. And then you could leave it nice and neat like that, or you could do kind of like, the ribbons are unraveling a bit. One of these sides has a slight grooves on it, so that as it comes out it has what is called a basket weave, so that it has slight texture across the top of it. It's designed to do baskets where you're building them up like so, but it's not, I mean, you might like to do that style if you're making a basket with flowers on top or something, but otherwise it's probably not really that relevant. One that I do with this, I'll just try it with this. I don't know how it's going to go. But you can kind of make petals. So this is how you do the petals. You squeeze and then let it come out and then bring it back in. I'll actually try using the smooth side instead. So it goes out and then comes back in again. So yeah, it's not ideal because it doesn't have that nice definition of the finer tip, but you kind of get the idea. You just keep going around. Sorry, a little crumb. Yeah, doesn't look too bad.
Of the Buttercream basics.
Yeah, great. That was an awesome demo session. Thank you so much, Kristin. So I'll put more information about Kristin's cake business as well, so you can visit her Facebook page. And if you're local, I highly recommend that you try one of Kristin's cakes. They're amazing, good to eat and good to look at as well. So I'll put all of the information down below this Facebook page. We might invite Kristin to come back again in a couple of weeks to answer any questions that you've got. But thank you so much again. It was amazing.
Welcome.
And we'll chat to you guys soon.